one ever was a series called Beany and Cecil. Are you familiar with that one?
I've never seen it, but I suspect I know where you're going with this.
This is a beloved live-action show, I think, from the 50s, a puppet show.
Mm-hmm.
And the creator of it, who was dead by the time we got involved, was a guy named Bob Clampett, who was one of the original Warner Brothers animators of Bugs Bunny era, who worked with Friz Freleng and Chuck Jones and these legends. And so this guy, Bob Clampett, was sort of a legend. And he created this puppet show called Beany and Cecil. And we got involved in doing the animated version of it, and with his widow, Sodie Clampett, and her son, who I want to say his name was, I believe, Jed Clampett, but maybe I'm thinking of the Beverly Hillbillies. I can't remember his name. Yeah, well, anyway, what was her son's name? I can't remember.
I'm going to find it for you. I'll let you go on, and I'll tell you.
All right. Anyway, Sodie and her son were the rights holders in that situation, and she had an agent that was actively involved in this whole thing, and ABC was the network. And it all started fine, and I think ABC wanted us to hire, at that time, an interesting choice for story editor, which I'll tell you in a second. But I should preface it by saying that this happened during one of the Writers Guild strikes. And when the Writers Guild goes on strike, most animated series, certainly all of the Saturday morning animated series, were not covered under the Writers Guild contract. In other words, when you wrote on a Saturday morning series, it was not a Writers Guild situation. And Saturday morning writers didn't get residuals, and they didn't get the same benefits. It was really sort of an inferior setup for animation writers, and all animation writers resented this like crazy. We all wanted to be in the Writers Guild. The Writers Guild wanted to have us, were willing to take us on, but none of the studios wanted to let that happen because it would have made it more onerous on them, and they would have had to. It would have been more costly for them to have Writers Guild shows. So the way the industry was structured at that time, and is still largely structured, is all the Saturday morning and kids animated shows were not Writers Guild shows, whereas, later shows like The Simpsons and such were Writers Guild shows. But anyway, back then when we did Beany and Cecil, the Writers Guild was on strike. And so a lot of live action writers that otherwise would not have been available to work in animation needed the work. And there was a writer by the name of, drumroll, Chuck Lorre, who, by the way, got his first writing gig at DiC before I worked there. At the dawn of DiC, Chuck Lorre's career actually started at DiC. And for anybody listening that doesn't know who Chuck Lorre is, and I can't imagine there is anybody, but he went on to do Big Bang Theory and
Two and a Half Men.
He did so many prime. Pardon me?
2.5 Men.
2.5 Men.
Roseanne at one point.
Mom, is that the one that's on now? I don't watch a lot of primetime, but he went on to be arguably the most successful primetime showrunner and producer in history. Worth hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars and playing golf with President Obama. I mean, and in the Television Hall of Fame. I mean, really truly one of the most successful creators in television history. Got his first job at DiC, and in this my story I'm telling became the story editor for Beany and Cecil while he was working on primetime. I think he was working on Roseanne. I think he was working on Roseanne. He worked on Roseanne. I think it might have been when he was working, or Dharma and Greg, or one of those. Anyway, ABC wanted him to be the story editor on Beany and Cecil, and Writers Guild strike. He was available, and he had a history of, certainly with Andy. I hadn't met him prior to that, and he said okay. So we hired Chuck Lorre to be our story editor. Great. And then Sodie wanted a director by the name of John Kricfalusi.
Yay, this is where I thought you were going with this.
Yeah. And this guy was sort of a notorious bad boy in animation. Really talented, by the way. Super, super talented guy. Gifted. But just not somebody willing to sort of play by the rules and just had his own ideas and really didn't seem to care what anybody else thought. He went on to do Ren and Stimpy, which, as anybody who knows that show, really pushed the boundaries of things like taste and network censors and all that stuff. So, okay, so we've got Chuck Lorre, we got ABC, and we got John Kricfalusi, and we got Sodie Clampett, who is the widow of the beloved Bob Clampett.
By the way, Bob Clampett Jr. is the son.
Okay. I can't believe I said Jed Clampett. That is really stupid. I'm really starting to feel like an old man now. That is funny. I'm just laughing at myself. Jesus, that is bad.
She didn't call him Granny.
Anyway, so we're off to I'll say that again. So we're off to the races with Chuck Lorre, ABC, John Kricfalusi, Sodie Clampett, who is the widow of this beloved animation creator, and Andy Hayward and Robby London in the middle of all this. And, it all starts, all series start with the best of intentions. And I don't know how quickly, but this thing went so far south where every single person was fighting with every other person. I mean, it was just a nightmare. They all hated each other by the end of it. Although I think Chuck and ABC were sort of on the same side of things, but they were on the completely opposite side of the Clampetts, and I'm not sure where John Kricfalusi was in all of it, but he just basically did what he wanted and paid no attention to anybody. And he would put stuff in there that was so inappropriate. He'd sneak things in, and there was subliminal cuts of things that he was trying to put in, where he'd put in 2 frames that you wouldn't see unless you stopped the film. And I think almost everything he tried to put in, Kricfalusi, got caught. But the networks had a division called Standards and Practices, which was essentially the network censors, and their job was to make sure nothing inappropriate went on the air, and their job was also to decide what was appropriate and inappropriate, what was allowable and what was not allowable. And they reviewed scripts, by the way, too. And I should add, when I named all the people that weren't getting along, there was also the Network Standards and Practices Department that had to review and approve every script. And they were frequently at odds with their own creative executives. In other words, the creative executives sort of had the creative approvals, and the Standards and Practice executives had the we will allow this, we will not allow this kind of approvals. And they would frequently butt heads. So, I mean, I just can't tell you how much conflict there could be on certain series with all these parties all having rights. And Beany and Cecil was the apex or nadir, depending on how you want to look at it, of the most difficult situation I've ever been in my career in terms of conflicting approvals and conflicting personalities and headstrong personalities. And as such, it was the only series that I know of in history. Networks always order 13 half hours, and the way animation is produced, you have to finish all 13 scripts long before first episode goes on the air. So, you have to have a real lead time in animation. And so we wrote 13 scripts, I'm sure. But Beany and Cecil was the only, and we probably were in production, at some stage of production, on 13 episodes. Beany and Cecil is the only network series that I am aware of that was canceled before even 13 episodes aired. And it wasn't because of ratings. It was because of conflict. And it ended up in a tremendous lawsuit. And I'm going on a long time about this because it's just it's a funny story. But
well, people want to hear.
But ended up in a lawsuit. It's the only time I've ever been deposed in court. I wasn't in court, but I was in the deposition. It's the only time I remember being in a deposition. And there were issues like, apparently John Kricfalusi submitted a storyboard that put testicles on the sea serpent, which is so inappropriate and so beyond the pale of what Standards and Practices would ever allow. And I think he tried to sneak it in after Standards and Practices had given their approvals to the storyboard. I think Kricfalusi had somehow tried to sneak it into the animation without any of us knowing it. He did things that none of us knew about. He was fired eventually, of course. And I mean, I would get asked things like, this is under oath. I'm being testifying under oath. There's a court reporter, and Mr. London, can you tell us why you would put testicles on a sea serpent? And I would say things like, well, I suppose so it could reproduce. I mean, the whole thing was so nonsensical. I mean, even the court reporter would crack up. I mean, it was a riot. It was funny, but it was also a nightmare at the same time. And I think ultimately the lawsuit settled, and we all moved on, and that was the end of that. But it was really it had the most drama of anything I ever worked with Beany and Cecil. I don't know what got me into that. I think we were talking about difficult
people to work with.
Yeah, and the irony is the irony of that is I really none of those people were particularly difficult. They were just all headstrong, and they had different ideas. I mean, Sodie Clampett was a lovely person, and I was very friendly with her agent, who was right in the middle of her agent was totally in the middle of all this stuff. And I got along great with Chuck Lorre. He was fine. And I got along fine with ABC. This was a case where there wasn't really, somebody that I would blame. It was just a situation where you had parties that were granted rights and had completely different opinions and did not want to give up their rights.
You listed all of the parties involved except one for We're Nice People.
You mean on that show, you mean?
You said that, yeah, you said Chuck was great. You said the Clampetts were great. You said ABC was great. There was one person you left out. John.
Oh, Kricfalusi?
Yeah.
Here's the truth. I didn't have that much dealings with Kricfalusi because once the scripts were done, to some degree, the work went out of my purview. We always had people that were in charge of sort of the physical production of the animation. That wasn't really my expertise. And so I had some dealings with them, but it wasn't a lot. But listen, my dealings with Kricfalusi were, he was not an unpleasant person at all. He was personable. He was very personable. He wasn't, John Kricfalusi was not an unlikable person. He was just a rebel. He was the kind of person I was when I didn't have to be an executive. When it wasn't my problem, I would have done the same things, would have wanted to do the same. I personally like the kind of humor that John Kricfalusi does. And I like things that push the envelope. And I'm not easily offended. So I didn't have a creative problem with Kricfalusi did, but he just didn't accept the realities of what you could get away with and what you couldn't. He was not a realist and I was. I think that would be the difference, I would say, between the John Kricfalusis of the world and me. It wasn't a difference in taste or sensibilities. It was a difference in accepting reality. Because ultimately all the things he did not get on the air. They were all for no purpose at all other than to entertain himself. They didn't make it through.
Did you guys ever slip the things in that they always talk about? They call it slipping things past the radar. Try to sneak in subtle things past the censors on various shows.
Yes, sometimes you would. I would never allow for anything that I was the one amongst my many other duties at DiC. I was the one that was responsible for answering all complaints. Anytime there was a viewer complaint or a sponsor complaint or any kind of a complaint about our programming, I was the one that would have to deal with it. That's what I used for my standards. And my instinct was, if I felt I could, in good conscience, defend what we did from any complaint, I would allow it. To the degree I could control it, sometimes it wasn't up to me. On the network series, it was ultimately the network standards and practices division that were the final arbiter of those things, not me. I was not the final arbiter on those series. But on syndicated series, I was to some degree the final arbiter of taste and I was the ultimate censor on series because syndication didn't really have a mechanism for censorship. I was it. And that was the standard that I used was if I felt I could defend it in good conscience, I would let it go by. In terms of slipping things by, yeah, sometimes you would do it. If you felt it really wasn't hurting anybody and it was just sort of a sly thing you could get away with that maybe people would notice, maybe people wouldn't, but it wasn't really going to do any damage. I was okay with it. I'd let it go. And some of the other strategies you would do, and you've heard this, I'm sure, is sometimes you would deliberately write things in and put things in that you knew were going to be censored. So it would sort of take the censor's attention away from the other things that you hoped they wouldn't bother. Like you hoped that on a given script they would only spend so much time and only haggle you over a certain number of things. Sometimes you'd put in things that you were willing to give over and that you were willing to give up in hopes that they would overlook the things that you felt were important and you hoped they wouldn't give up. So that certainly was a strategy that was used, yes. It was a chess game. It was a battle of wits sometimes with the censors because I think all creators, myself included, would feel that the censors could really sometimes be overzealous and sometimes to a ridiculous degree. And as I mentioned, they were oftentimes fighting with their own. Oftentimes we would be in cahoots with the network's programming department. Together we would go fight the censors. So it was oftentimes an internal fight at the network over, what would be allowed and what wouldn't be allowed.
You